Giuquit, hello. Welcome to the podcast series of the Center for Irish Studies at Villanova University. My name is Joseph Lennon, Emily C. Riley, Director of the Center.
And I'm Jennifer Joyce, Associate Director and Curator of this series. We appreciate the support from our many donors, especially a generous grant from the Connolly Foundation.
This podcast series aims to reflect aspects of Irish studies through the 9 different academic disciplines that are taught through Villanova's Center for Irish Studies. Our faculty and students will engage in discussions with distinguished thinkers, artists, writers, academics, political leaders, and other campus visitors.
We are very excited for our second season of this podcast. Our episodes this year explore current issues about race and dive into traditional song and story. Thank you so much for listening. And if you are looking for more Irish Studies events, please join us virtually this year for a rich menu of programming. You can follow us on social media, find us at our website, or email us at irishstudies@villanova.edu.
Today I'm talking with Hannah Khalil, who is our 2021 Heimbold Chair at Villanova University. Hannah was raised in the United Arab Emirates and in Ireland and lives in London. She started out as an actor, but has moved to playwriting, and we are the great recipients and beneficiaries of that. So welcome, Hannah. I'm talking to you across the pond. You're over in London as we speak.
I am, yeah.
And I'll just start out with a question about teaching at Villanova. How do you find our students? Do you like them? They're great kids.
They are absolutely lovely. It's such a strange situation to not be able to meet them, have met them yet in person, and of course, you get so much more when you're in a room with people. I mean, for a start, you can give them a hug. I'm a big hugger. Obviously, that's a problem at the moment.
For a theater person, you have to hug.
Exactly. So, but they're all giving me virtual hugs in that they're so kind of warm and generous and really helping me out with the technology, but also really alive to the things that we're talking about. And they're just a really lovely bunch of people. Feel very lucky.
I feel the same way. I think our students are, and I shouldn't just brag about our students, but they are wonderful. I thought that you mentioned just before we started taping that you have a new anthology coming out, which is congratulations. Can you tell us
Thank
2
you.
seconds
It's very
about
exciting.
that?
Yeah, it's the first anthology of my plays, which is something that I guess all playwrights want at some point. And Methuen, who are the theatre imprint of Bloomsbury in the UK, are going to be publishing hopefully in autumn this year, autumn 2021, and it's going to be called Plays of an Arab Heritage. So it's going to centre on my plays that look at kind of what my experience has been, because obviously I can't talk for everybody. But
No.
It's really exciting.
None of us can talk for everybody, but you're doing a great job in bringing stories that need to be told and people are interested in. You're doing a wonderful job in bringing those to light. I'm going to ask you just a few more questions that are focused on your plays. They focus on very human moments set within these larger historical events and injustices and upheavals. Plan D focuses on the Nakba, the Palestinian exodus, or at that time period in 1948. In your later play, Scenes from 68 Years, or I guess it would now be, because there's an asterisk after 68, it would be 73, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So how many years since? We witnessed many instances of pain spread across generations, as in the really very moving final scene. Can you tell us about your decision to use alternating structures in the play so that going between times, particularly in scenes from 68, 73 years?
So Plan D is the first play that I wrote about Palestine. I was really terrified of taking it on as a subject, of being seen as a spokesperson. I didn't feel like I had the right to do that. And I was always writing plays that had Arab characters, always wanted to redress the balance of the way people from the same background as me or a similar background as me are portrayed in the media, which I think is not ever fair. And so, but I was scared to write about Palestine. And then I went to a really interesting seminar at SOAS, which is the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And their Palestinian Society had an oral histories day. And it was all about the Nakba. And there was a brilliant project that was talked about called Towards a Common Archive. And it was a film project being put together by an Israeli filmmaker called Eyal Savan. And the idea was he was traveling around Israel and interviewing both Palestinians and Israelis who'd lived through 1948 in an effort to get the stories down, because he felt like they hadn't been recorded in a sort of meaningful way. And obviously all these people are getting older.
Right.
So I listened to some of these stories and I thought, oh my goodness, these are brilliant and really interesting. And so I went away and did more research, and definitely I can pinpoint that as the moment that Plan D came into existence as a kind of idea and in my head. And it came at the same time as I was sort of having conversations about some of my other plays with some institutions in this country, some theatre institutions. And I was constantly being criticised for the fact that the way that I use structure in my plays, in some of my very, very early plays, there was a sort of a feeling or people were telling me that I wrote very interesting characters, but it was such a shame I didn't know how to write traditional 3-act structure, which I found infuriating and quite patronising. So these two things came together, and I ended up, I was sort of wanting to go and do, I've not had any professional formal training as a playwright. And so I was thinking maybe I should go and do a master's, but I couldn't really afford it. And someone said to me, no, you don't need to do that. If you're worried about structure, just steal it. And I was like, what do you mean steal it? They said, find a play that has classical structure that you really love and just steal the structure, just copy the structure. And so that's what I did. So Plan D is basically sort of a tracing paper over a play called The Wild Duck by Ibsen. And it's a play that I really love. And it obviously, Ibsen's play has nothing to do with Palestine, but it is a family story. And so so I sort of took the structure in terms of where the inciting event happens and where the climax happens. And I used that as a kind of framework from which to hang the story of Plan D. And so that's why Plan D is the shape it is. But then with Scenes, what happened was after Plan D was on in London in 2010, loads of people came and approached me after the show and said, oh, it's so interesting to see that story being told. This is what happened to my family. This is what is happening to my family. So I got all these amazing stories gifted to me. And I would go home at night and I would write notes in a book, and I'd say to my husband, what am I going to do? I've got so many amazing stories. If I write these all into plays, that's going to be I won't complete that as a life's work. There's too much. So I decided that I would try and use a kind of patchwork approach. And I'd seen a play. This wasn't conscious at all at the time, but looking back, I realised I must have been influenced by Owen McCafferty's play Scenes from the Big Picture.
Oh, right, okay.
Which I had seen at the National.
Right.
So I must have been, and I loved that play.
It was a Heimbold chair a few years ago, right?
Exactly. And but at the time I wasn't consciously doing it, but I had seen the national production of it and loved it, and so that must have been in my head. That must have given me permission some way to do this. And so I set out to write each of these stories as a scene, which was joyous. And I was obsessed with a drama on television at the time called The Wire, which I'm sure you have heard of, the American drama. And what I loved about The Wire was the way that in most scenes, the writers set up a scenario whereby you think you know what's going on, and by the end of the scene, they've undercut your expectations. So actually, your own prejudice and bias is revealed. The scene that stands out most strongly for me is there's a scene where there's a big kind of altercation between the cops and the drug dealers. and this cop is beating up one of the drug dealers, and the female cop runs in, and you presume she's going to break them up, but she doesn't. She pushes that guy out of the way so she can punch him, so she can punch the drug dealer. And so I was trying with every scene to give a sense of, like, for the audience, oh, okay, I know where I am with this. And then by the end of the scene, undercut the expectation, to give a feeling of what life might be like in a world where things change very quickly and you have no control over it.
And with a topic such as Palestine, there are so many opinions and so many political viewpoints, and you really weave it masterfully, that we have these expectations. Oh, is this going to be a political statement? Oh, is that? Oh, this is the stance. And then we move to something else that's more really humane in a sense, and less about the big picture in a sense. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think I'm not really interested in plays that sort of tell you what to think or back up what you already think. I'm really interested in asking questions and not necessarily answering them. And so I guess the question is, how does anyone, whichever side of the wall you're living on, how do you live in this situation? How is it possible to continue? But writing those scenes was joyous, and the difficulty then came, how do you make an order? I'm not doing the 3-act structure in a traditional way. This is the story of a community. This is a story of a people. How do you shape it? And that's where, my amazing collaborators come into play. So we had so many different readings of the play. We tried the scenes in different orders. We got initially none of the scenes were linked at all. I was insisting that each scene would be self-contained and that would be the end of it. But I realized very quickly, as soon as we did a reading, that the audience started going, well, that person is clearly that person, and that person is clearly that. That's the same person.
We are meaning making. We are meaning making machines.
Exactly. And I was like, okay, well, if they're going to do it anyway, I should do it. I should take control of that.
That's right.
And so it grew and grew and grew, and changed, and some beautiful scenes were cut, and new ones came into being. But it was the work of many drafts and many years to get it what felt like right. And right up till kind of the first night of the production in London, we were changing things and cutting things and moving them around. But I feel like we landed on something that's really special.
It's magical. And when the ending of the play in particular, now I have not seen it, and I long to see it. But the ending of the play really, I think you mentioned once you were surprised by the audience's response to it, and I don't want to give anything away. It's not. There's no car chase or aliens that land at the end of the play, but it is very moving. I want to ask you also about, in a museum in Baghdad, the struggle to maintain historical awareness and cultural Persian culture. And an awareness surrounded by the violence and war in Iraq after, in one time period, British colonialism, and in the other, the American invasion and the war. The play allows us to see history repeating itself, which is something that we don't often get to do, in such a clear way. And you have this character, Abu Zaman, the father of time character. He bears witness to the violence, but interestingly, to me at least, he has a hope to influence the future. And I wonder about you as a playwright, and you clearly, to me, it seems you have what Adorno would call a committed approach. You have a commitment in your plays. What do you think about shaping the future when you're writing these? Are you thinking about saving stories, as you said, or do you have other? It's not necessarily a political program, right?
Yeah,
what do you think about it?
The way that I come to what I'm going to write about is always about something that I feel angry about, or I feel, or that I don't know enough about, or I don't understand. I think that this is what provokes me to work. And also I find writing to be very beneficial for my mental health, and that it's a really good way for me to sort of understand, work things out, and or try, or just to pose questions. But of course, I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to change the world, because I think every writer wants to change the world. And I think if you can I think theatre has a unique ability, something about the liveness of it and human beings in front of you, but also human beings next to you and you being part of a community as you watch a play, that can really access in an incredibly visceral way things that you might not get from other art forms, and can provoke change, can help, can encourage people to get up and do something.
It puts you in a room, in a space with other people, people who are trying to do something, either tell a story or come into a space or leave a space. It works so nicely in the censor, or how to write a play. Sorry, what's the full subtitle? The second part.
How to put on a political play without being fined or arrested. It's a nice short pithy.
Yeah, and my wife is Italian from northern Italy, and she has a lot of partisan stories in her family history. And so when Bella Ciao came up at the end of the play, it was very emotional for me and for others. But I would say that I'm interested in that sense of what you're doing in that space of creating an atmosphere, showing how there are these human stories behind the politics of putting on a play. I was going to ask you about the SCAR test, but before I do that, could you comment just briefly? You have a dental scene, a dental office, which is, for me, is wildly uncomfortable, right? And there's all of these crazy sexual innuendos and homophobic remarks and other things that are coming into that. And then we alternate back to this political scene and these protesters and whatnot. Why dentists? Why a dental zone?
Well, so the original idea was, so the idea for the censor came from, there is a brilliant Egyptian theatre maker called Layla Suleiman, and she was in London and there was a reading of one of her plays, and then she did a talk afterwards, and someone asked her, how can you, this is pre-Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, how can you rehearse such a political play in Egypt? How do you do it? And she said, you have to have 2 plays. And I went, oh, that's brilliant. That's a cool idea for a play. Oh, 2 plays, you know. And I have been accused of being the person who likes to fit as many plays into one play as humanly possible. With
well, you do a good job of
as well. But so that's where that idea was born, and I think I wanted to find a farce that would work. That could sit within, within the structure. And so I was looking at one-act farces that I could adapt and do my own version of. And I came across this Fader farce that was set in a dentist. And so I thought, right, that's good. I'll adapt that. And it can't be a coincidence that I had rewatched The Marathon Man quite closely to that, to that decision being made. And I also, I just think I love the idea of kind of the torture chair and the dentist. Do you know what I mean? It's got great resonance, hasn't it? Most people hate the dentist.
Right. Well, there's the tension. You have all of these very domestic scenes. And in the Palestinian plays, the plays about the Arab world, the checkpoints, applying for a passport, food, or even, one scene, you have all of these very domestic scenes and people around the table talking over food. You take a different approach in the SCAR test. So we have these I have to say, it's very Irish in this sort of revival to have a table at the center of the stage and, a hearth, a fire, and then all of these things happening. So I keep thinking of Sean O'Casey when I'm reading your plays or singing. But in the SCAR test, the space is used in a very different way. We have these stories of women who seem lost or captured by this harsh bureaucratic system and this harrowing immigration process. The racism is explicit and clear, as is the sexism. But this is a story. Why did you feel that you needed to tell this story? Let me just throw that out as a very big question.
Sure. So I had a play on a monologue on in London, and like a pub theatre. And afterwards, I was approached by a producer actor called Nadia Nadif, who came and said to me, "I really liked your monologue. Have you ever thought about writing something about women in detention in this country?" And I said, "People aren't detained in the UK."
No.
And she said, "Oh, yes, they are." And I was like, "What?" And then I went home and I looked into it, and I was horrified and I was embarrassed, and that I didn't know about it. And so I went back to her and said, "Yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. This is happening. I'm not sure if it's something that I should be writing about, because this is also always the big question: is, am I the right person to write this play? Why should I write it? Is there someone who's going to bring something more to it than me?" And I went to meet a woman called Heather Jones, who had set up a charity called Yarlswood Befrienders, who she's this incredible woman, and the charity basically gets people and brings them into meet with women who are being detained as a kind of a link to the outside world and a friend, basically. And I thought I'd go and chat to her for half an hour or so. And in the end, I spent a whole day with her, and by the end of it, I was crying, and I had all these amazing stories, and I just thought, yeah, I feel really compelled to write about this. And then I went into Yarlswood and met some women who were being detained, and that further made me think I absolutely have to write their stories. So yeah, so that's how that play came about. Yeah.
Villanova's they're in rehearsal right now, our students, to stage the play. So it's going to be streamed in March on the 28th, and then the following weekend as well. By the way, for those who are listening, all of this information is up on the Irish Studies website for the Center for Irish Studies. Speaking of the center and college life, university life and people applying to university appear in your plays. I'm wondering, you have some younger characters heading off to study or making plans, some having their hopes realized, some you're thinking maybe this isn't going to happen. Could you talk about your interest in this? Is this a sense of hope? Is that what it provides for you in the play?
I think so. I think it's also really complicated. It's often the question of to stay or to go. And my dad left Palestine when he was about 14, and he went to Kuwait. And he's incredibly inspiring in that, he was so young, and he managed to get a job in a hospital in Kuwait as a kind of sort of a porter or a helper. But he knew that he needed to learn English, and he didn't have the means to do it. And the boy who was in the room next door to him was an English student. And so my dad would borrow his books, and he had no electricity, so he would sit on the motorway in the nights under the lights to teach himself English. And it's something about this drive and this sort of, that is so incredible and inspiring. But also it's sort of really sad, because he knew that in order to be able to make something of himself and to support his family, he would have to not be in Palestine. Like, that was very clear to him. So it's this kind of double-edged sword, I guess. And also, the double-edged sword of, as soon as you are studying, we've been talking about this actually in my class with my wonderful Villanova students, about the irony of the way that colonial structures provide education, but then the indigenous peoples are receiving an education that comes from the colonial power, and what that means and what that does and what the legacy of that is. The same reason why my dad always aspired to wear Savile Row suits and be British and have a British passport, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, so, our chair of Chiji Akoma, Dr. Chiji Akoma, often tells the story. He's our chair of global interdisciplinary, of growing up in Nigeria, and always thinking A is for apple, but they didn't eat apples.
exactly. So that the deep sort of irony that, my dad always wore Savile Row suits, even in the Middle East, in the wretched heat.
Mm.
So yeah. So I guess university, a wonderful thing, a wonderful opportunity. I'm the first person in my bit of my family to go to university, and my parents are very proud of that. But also, what that means for people if it means leaving, and how difficult it is if we're talking about Palestine, how difficult it is to go back.
Yeah. Speaking of leaving and emigration, that seems to be one of the common themes between Irish American, Irish diaspora, and Palestinian diaspora, Arab world diaspora literature. That sense of exile, of politics in the background. It's in my own family. It's in so many people's families. I'm wondering where else are you? And you're teaching this wonderful class with Irish and Palestinian texts. Where else are you seeing connections? What other connections do you see that leap out?
Well, we're only 3 or 4 weeks,
Yeah,
but I think the strength of women within those societies and the things that they have to take on and endure. I think an incredible ability to find humour in the darkest situations, always. And also, we had a really interesting conversation last week, the students and I, about childhood and when childhood ends, and who decides that, and at what point does a young person find out the truth about the world in which they are living? And how lucky we are that we're in a situation where our children in America and in England hopefully are in safe spaces where they can be children and can play, but it's very different if you come from a place of conflict, obviously.
And I would say even within the United States there are there are safer and less safe.
Absolutely, and the UK too.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that at Villanova in particular, but in many privileged places, we don't often pay attention, or students are maybe even not aware of how so many people across the world live. So many people who still farm and are absolutely dependent on things like that.
Sure.
So I really appreciate the work that you're doing in creating these plays that are very alive for our students and for people in general. I want to go back to your father for a second, if I might. You mentioned him shortening his name when he applied for the passport. And I wonder if you could maybe tell us that briefly. But it appears again, or at least that story appears in scenes from 68, 73 years, suggesting how immigration even changes people's identities.
Absolutely.
And as a sort of, with my academic hat on, I think about that as it shows the trace of the passage, right? So something endures of that trace, that change in our name, that change in who we are, how we think about ourselves, endures. Could you tell us that story?
Sure. So weirdly, it all started around when I got married, and my husband's surname is White, and I was very, very clear that I would be keeping my name. I was not going to become Hannah White. I was going to be Hannah Khalil. I would be keeping my name. And my husband had absolutely no problem with that. But the big irony was that shortly after I got married, I got an email from my dad telling me he was changing his email address, and he was changing it from Majid Khalil to Majid Musla. And I was like, okay, sure, but why Musla? And he emailed back and said, because that's our name. And I went, what? My birth certificate, my passport, your passport, every document I've ever seen has the name Khalil. I didn't know, what is this name, Musla? And he told me this story that when he went to the passport office, in what must have been sort of late 50s, early 60s, in Jerusalem to get his very first passport. He waited, he queued for hours, and when he got to the front of the queue and handed his form, the official at the front said, "Oh, your name's too long," and just drew a line through the last few names. So he became Majid Khalil. I mean, it's bizarre. And then there's a chance we may never have had that conversation, which I find quite strange. Well, thanks to Google Mail that he was changing his account,
Right. It's, I mean, just the things that go unsaid, and the things that don't get uncovered are enormous. Absolutely. But thankfully, you've recovered that. I also wanted to ask you, and this will just maybe be our last question, so that we can move on to. I'll let you get back to your evening there, your approaching evening. How is writing plays changed after this pandemic? How are you thinking about things differently? Because I mean, we're all now on these screens. We've spent much more time in rooms with people, our family. What's changed for you? Is the domestic drama there? Is the using screens on stage there? What is it?
I think the thing that's changed and that won't go away now is that sort of digital theatre will exist. But I think the problem is that we are not yet entirely sure what that means. And I mean, I'm having conversations literally, like yesterday I had a conversation about a commission that I'm working on at the moment that will be an online commission, a piece that will be digital. But the conversation about how to make it theatre, and I feel very strongly that if it's recorded, it's not theatre, it has to be live. So we were having a lot of chats about that, and about kind of how best to do that. So I think, and I don't think even when we're in a place where we can go back into theatres and sit as audiences in theatres, I think running alongside that work, there will always now be digital work, I think, because I think this has changed everything. But I think we really need to interrogate how to make theatre work online. For me, it's so much about liveness and being in the space. And also I realised that, when I watch theatre online, I'm on my own, or at best with my husband and daughter in my sitting room. Whereas when I'm in an audience, I'm my best self. I'm a brilliant audience member. I'm a great member of that community. But when I'm sat on my sofa, I'm, get up to go to the loo or check my phone. I'm not as captive as I am in a positive way in the theatre. So I think I'm thinking a lot about that and and I'm desperate to get back into a theatre space. I'm really missing it. Like I made work in 2020. So I did a few new pieces. The censor, luckily, I was able to get into the odd rehearsal and I got to see it live.
And it's still up on YouTube. So
on YouTube.
I hope they keep it up.
It's still there. Yeah, I think it will stay for a little while. But I made two other pieces. I think you watched my Greek myths. I did those, and which were great fun. And I also did an adaptation of Penelope from. It was a sort of 15 heroines. It was an Ovid kind of adaptation for the German street theatre, which was great. But what's so strange is both of those teams that I made work with, I have never met them in person.
Wow.
I find that
That's so weird.
Being in a room with them, and the same with
But even with the Greek myths one,
yes.
Can you say 2 words about that, because I haven't mentioned it?
I loved it so much. So Waterman's Theatre in Brentford, in just sort of West London, commissioned me to adapt 4 Greek myths for kids. And I was so excited to do it because I've wanted to write something for young people for a really long time, because I have my daughter who's 9, and the 2 or 3 or the team who made it are so brilliant, and the designer Sam is just the king. I call him the king of cardboard. Like, he can literally make anything out of cardboard.
It's amazing.
And so so much joy watching. He had like a sort of a Dropbox that he puts kind of videos as he's making stuff. And if I had a day where I was feeling a bit blue, I'd just drop in and see,
That's
how's
so
he doing
clever.
Midas, or how's this happening? Or it's just joy. So I'm hoping we'll get to do some more together, but trying to also think of a way to do a sort of feminist take on those myths. Do it in 10 minutes and have something that joins them, sort of a narrator who can link them. It was joyous. It was some of my favorite work I made last year, and I really want to do more of it. So,
and to do it for children too. I mean, so
that's great.
It's, I think of Marina Carr redoing, Medea or something where there's a lot more blood, and brilliant. But for kids, it's a different thing. I don't want to keep you, but I really want to thank you taking this on during the pandemic and coming to Villanova virtually. I'm very grateful. And
well, I'm very honored and
students.
delighted that you asked, and I'm so happy to be doing it. It's bringing me an awful lot of joy. It's taking me out of London without ever leaving my.
And I hope you can come over in April. So
I have everything literally crossed.
And if not, we'll have you over. Absolutely.
Good. Well, I'll be turning up. I'll be doorstepping.
So thank you very much, Hannah Khalil.
Thank you.